Hello, and welcome to FHIR Subscriptions Connectathon 29 specification walkthrough. This video is going to focus on the R4B version. We'll do another video with the R5 version. Yeah, we'll just walk through the spec and make sure everything makes sense and go from there. So we're going to go through, there's a couple of pieces to the R4B specification, and that is because there's the core FHIR spec changes and there's the backport IG itself. So, again, links will be here below, but we're going to use the CI build of the backport IG, which is working again now that we have Connectathon cuts of R4B. So we'll post the link to that. And then we are going to look at the 430 snapshot 1, which is the Connectathon, January Connectathon cut of R4B. For that, you can look actually in hl7.org/fhir/directory.html. And there's also links in the main thing to look at the publication history. And so this has all of the officially published versions. And of note to us is it includes things like the January 22 Connectathon R4B snapshot. And then in the next video, we'll look at the R5 version, same thing, snapshot. But again, we have handy dandy links to all of this here already. So the backport implementation guide itself, we can see this is following the standard HL7 format. So we have the nice HL7 and FHIR logos. We have our title, our version. This actually needs to be updated because this is not the ballot version anymore, but updating versions happens when you do the publication, so that is still correct as of right now. The next thing here in this red bar is the navigation. It's just a standard navigation menu, table of contents, home, the page we're on. Drop downs for things like the specification and artifacts, there's safety and security, and downloads. So nothing too interesting there. And then a standard breadcrumbs, table of contents, home, etc. So the home page here, this is just the general information about this implementation guide. You can see there's the kind of the whys and wherefores about why this implementation guide exists, which the too long didn't read version is that FHIR R5 has topic-based subscriptions, and people wanted it in FHIR R4 due to a whole plethora of reasons, which we don't need to dive into too far. The very short version of subscriptions, what are they? And it's just the way of the server telling the client that something happened instead of the client polling the server. And again, there's a video talking about that in a lot more depth as well. People have asked that we include a little bit of background information about what the query-defined subscriptions are, particularly in this implementation guide, because this is built on R4, and in R4 there are subscriptions. It's just that they're query-based subscriptions. And so there's a little bit more information here and a little bit more of the reasoning on why the move to topic-based subscriptions was decided on. But again, there's details here on that. And then what we're targeting here, which is to say we've already modified R5. When we go look at the R5 builds in the next video, we can see that these resources are there. This is already defined and has been going through this process, and we're just bringing things back into R4 to match. Boundaries and relationships, in particular, people often want to know about how this relates to FHIRcast and FHIR messaging. In the other video, I always mention CDS hooks as well, but people are pretty clear on that distinction. So I like to do that, and just some authors and contributors information. So that's the home. Then we get into the actual specification. So, excuse me. Here, the first part of the specification itself is just defining the actors. If you're familiar in healthcare, this is a common way of describing. I believe IHE is the one who popularized it. But it's essentially saying what are the different components, the different the different software systems, potentially hardware systems, that are going to be involved. And that's why there's not really a great term for it, except for an actor in the scene of subscriptions. So in this case, we're defining three things. There's the FHIR server itself, which we'll commonly refer to as the server, and that is the actual FHIR endpoint that's going to be sending notifications. We're going to create subscriptions on it. It implements the subscription topics, all of that kind of stuff. So that's the server in this context. The next piece is the FHIR client or subscriber. And that'll be generally shortened to client or subscriber, depending on the context. But this is the device that's saying, create this subscription. You know, it's representing the interest of a user, of a facility, whatever it is, saying, yes, this is something I need to know about, and send these notifications to the third actor, which is the endpoint. Now, the endpoint is just what's receiving the notifications. It's very likely and possible that the subscriber and the endpoint are the same piece of software. So for instance, if I'm on my mobile device and I'm creating a subscription and connecting via WebSockets and receiving those notifications, it's the same piece of software. But it's also possible that they're different. You can have things like the subscriber is actually managed internally at a facility because they're saying we're part of an HIE, a local network hospital interchange, and so we're actually managing that. We're the ones who are saying send this information somewhere, but that endpoint is the HIE. So you can see they could be the same, they could be different. We define them as different things just to make sure that we're clear on when we're talking about a client or an endpoint, but most often they're going to be the same thing. So topic-based subscription components. So this is talking about what makes up the specification of topic-based subscriptions. And there's really three regions, just like we thought about. There's the three actors. The first one is the subscription topic, which is defining the what is used to trigger notifications, the kinds of filters that clients are allowed to specify, additional resources that might be included with it, all of those kinds of things. We'll note it's always referenced by a canonical URL. Canonical didn't actually exist in R4, but there's still this concept of a URL representing a thing. And so that's how you refer to topics. In R4B, and this needs to be clarified a little better, I'll make a note of that, the versioning sequencing is kind of odd. Again, if we look at the directory here, prior to this Connectathon, where you can see things are nicely labeled 5.0.0 snapshot 1 and 4.3.0 snapshot 1, they were kind of out of order, the sequencing. So 4.0 was release FHIR R4, 4.1 was the ballot for R4B, but then 4.2 was R5, 4.3 is R4B, 4.4 is R5, and so there was kind of this kind of hard to sequence numbering. So I'll make a note and clarify this a little more, but essentially anything later than R4 has a subscription topic resource. So anything past 4.01 right now. Subscription. In the R4 version, which is what we're looking at, we could not make changes to this resource in R4B. So this is just the stock R4 subscription, which is the same as it was defined in 4.0 and 0 later, but we do have a bunch of extensions on it. So this is kind of just describing that, but you can see it's the way of linking a topic to a client. So you're saying, give me this topic, here are the filters I want, this is the channel that I want to communicate via, here's the endpoint to send the notifications to, here's the format information of what I want, all of that kind of stuff lives in the subscription. And then the last piece is the notification bundle. So this is what you receive at that endpoint, what the server sends to that endpoint, and then what the endpoint receives. It's really just describing the notification. It's a bundle. In R4, we're using the history bundle. In R5, we have a new bundle type that's very specific, and we can focus in and get the things we want. In R4, you can't just add bundle types. So we're using the history bundle because that is the closest thing we could find. It uses a subscription status resource, and that's going to give it meta information about the subscription itself and the notification itself that are involved in this transaction. And then it may or may not include additional things. So that's this last point here, that if you have an empty payload, that's it. You get a status resource and that nothing more. If you get ID only, then you'll have some URLs in there. And then if you get full resource, you'll have additional resources. So each of these link down to some further information. It should be hopefully what I was just discussing. So we can see that this is just talking about what a subscription topic is, what a subscription is. There's some information here about accepting subscription requests. So essentially we're saying if you're a server and you accept a subscription, you have to actually support that topic, and you have to make a best effort, a simple best effort at delivering notifications and things like that. So if you're a server and you don't support a topic, please don't accept the subscription request for it, because you'll never trigger a notification. Same thing if you don't support WebSockets, or if you don't support REST hooks or email, and someone requests a subscription that way, you can't change the notification, the channel type. You know, if I ask for email and you say, oh, I don't support email, but here's a REST hook, you don't have a URL, anything like that. There's no way I'll actually receive any of those notifications. So in those cases, you should just reject it. And then, some things that you can validate, that the subscription topic's there, the filters make sense, the payloads make sense, all of those kinds of things. You'll also need to comply with your server security policy if you're implementing the server, which is to say, if someone asks for full resources on sensitive information, you have a topic that's, contains sensitive information, and they're asking for a full resource to an HTTP endpoint that's not even using HTTPS, hopefully you're going to reject that. We can't put tons of that guidance in these implementation guides because the publication cycle is so long. So we do have some more links to security guidance, but generally speaking, make sure you are aware of security issues. And then again, talking about notifications, and that same explanation about the different bundle types and what's in there. This note here, scoping responsibilities, a lot of this is just talking about the fact that we are not defining in this specification reliable delivery or guaranteed delivery, depending on what term you're familiar with, which is to say, we're not promising every notification gets delivered, and we're also not promising that notifications are only delivered once. Both servers and clients should be aware that these types of things are going to happen, and should be coded defensively, to use the term that was popular a little while ago, to make sure that they accept those things. So if a server tries to send the same notification multiple times, a client should detect that. If a notification is missed, that it's got swallowed by some part of the process and got skipped, clients should be able to detect that, and we have mechanisms that this will go through to help that, handily linked here on the errors page. So this is just a note saying make sure you pay attention to those things as you're getting into actual implementations. So workflow. I'm a big fan of flowcharts. I think a lot of times they can make it clearer than the text. And so this is just kind of a general workflow showing the whole process. Again, we have our three actors, the FHIR server, the client, and the endpoint, and talking about how, a FHIR server has to implement subscriptions before any of this will work, has to pick some topics to implement before it'll work. A client has to also do those things, search for topics, get the topics back, figure out what it's doing, create whatever endpoint information it needs to. For instance, in the reference implementation, we stand up an HTTP endpoint, try to create the subscription. Once the server gets that request, if there's no handshake, so there's different protocols that may have a handshake or not, The server might set it to active. In this case, there's a valid subscription and the handshake works. So you can see the server is saying, okay, well, you've requested it. Now I'm going to do this handshake to the endpoint. That was successful. And so I'm going to update. Oh, this text is wrong. Let me make a note to fix that. Hopefully it'll be fixed before you even see this. But the status should be active here. And then failure goes to error. And then an invalid subscription just rejects, for instance, a 400 bad request. So you can see, and then kind of a discussion of the different steps that happen here. Channels. So this is going into the specifics of the different channel types. And so first we're talking about here that we're trying to cover most of the workflow, most of the use cases that we have, and then how to decide on them. Again, there's text here, but the general is REST hook is the most common, it's the most widely exercised, it's the most implemented so far in testing, everything else, and is likely to be the most common implementation overall for a while. So in general, if you can use a REST hook, that's probably going to be your best bet. Going down the decision tree, WebSockets so far are the most popular for things that can't do REST hooks. So if you have a client that's running in a web application or on a mobile device, things like that, there are a lot of scenarios where you can't stand up a REST hook easily, and so then WebSockets. Email, and the point here is email is even more widespread than web pages. Everyone has email, everyone has access to email, so particularly in like public health, things like that, where a small county may not have a domain, may not have a FHIR server, may not have any of these things. They'll still have an email address that you can use to send notifications, things like that. Going notifications to end users, consumers. If you don't have a mobile phone or things like that, you can likely still send an email that the user can pick up, the patient can pick up at some point. And then FHIR messaging, which if you're using FHIR messaging, you want to have FHIR messaging available, and if you're not using FHIR messaging, you probably aren't too interested. Essentially, it's the way of bundling FHIR communications when you don't have persistent REST. So you can say things like you are in a remote area that doesn't have always-on internet connectivity to your server, or network access to your server. And so you kind of, at the end of the day, can dial in, batch, do a bunch of activity, and then go on. And messaging is the protocol you're going to use for that. And then this last part here is custom channels. We know that there are a lot of use cases we're not covering. We're trying to cover a big swath, but we also want people to be able to do their own. So if you want, for instance, you want that guaranteed delivery. You're building your internal architecture and you want to be able to use subscriptions. Fine, build your message queue, define your channel. There's a codable concept, so you have a system and a code, and that way anyone connecting to your system can just use the message queue and follow that protocol, and that'll work fine. Another common one that it's been requested, but we aren't going to define as part of the core spec, are like the cloud-specific protocols. Every major cloud vendor has their own internal protocol they use for events and messaging and things like that. Great. If you're going to be inside that cloud provider, you will likely want to have that protocol supported. It can be defined and accessed. And then also other serialization formats. So if you have, and it's slipping my mind for some reason right now, but if you have a binary format or a very compact serialization format that you're using to try and reduce bandwidth during transfers, you can define that as part of your protocol and then use it there. So same thing here. We go through and have a bunch of information about each one individually. So again, I love my flowcharts. So you have the FHIR server REST API, you have the client, and then you have an HTTP, hopefully S, endpoint. And this just walks through, creating a subscription, doing the handshake. You can see the different bundle types that come through and explanations about all the steps. And that's happening for REST hooks. It's happening for WebSockets. It's happening for email. I guess I should note here, each of them also have a little security notes. So for instance, WebSockets, it's talking about some of the authentication challenges that the normal authentication header protocols are not really supported in WebSockets. And that's because the JavaScript WebSocket API doesn't have them. And so there's a whole token exchange protocol that we've defined for WebSockets to help get around that. HTTPS is talking about how you should be using HTTPS instead of HTTP, et cetera, et cetera. Email, again, we kind of delve into how this would work. Again, the most common use case for email has been public health. And so we kind of use that as the example to walk through just to have something concrete. But we talk about message bodies versus attachments and how to interpret, and specify things like, well, I want to text HTML message body so that I can have something nice that the user can look at. But then I also want to attach a FHIR XML. And so then you can have that bundle attached to it. And going through talking about all these things, security notes, email is not secure. Even if you have a secure channel between you and the email server, it's not likely to be an actual secure email system. We recommend using one such as Direct, which is kind of popular in healthcare. And then same thing, workflow for messaging and how it works. So that is channels. Then we have the next section here is notifications. And so here, this is just talking about the actual notifications you receive, which are a bundle. And then since we're in the R4 version, we're getting history bundles. And there's links out to all the different resources and things like that. This is just talking about how you can include both focus resource and additional resources. Again, we talked about it in the overview video, but in subscription topics, which we'll look at the resource here in a minute, but you can define additional resources that can go along with it. So in a patient admission, which is focused on the encounter, it's generally nice to have the actual patient record. It may be nice to have the location, different things like that, the organization. And so there's methods for adding all of those things. But a big note that it's a may. Some of these resources may or may not actually exist. A good example is when you're looking at discharge. There may be observations, there may be conditions, there may not be. There's no knowing. Even if there are, servers may or may not want to append them. They may be sensitive information that shouldn't be sent out to the clients, things like that. So again, just like we were talking about defensive programming for the events, you want to make sure for additional resources you can handle both cases. Take the optimized case, assume be able to get all of these things and process them and use them, but also have in mind that you might not always get them. Payload types, and again, we've talked about this in the overview video in a little more depth, but we have empty payloads, ID-only payloads, and full resource, which is just what gets included in these notification bundles. And we have a similar diagram here that we have in the slides from that presentation. But you can see if the FHIR server is sending to an empty, an ID-only, or a full resource. In empty, everyone gets the initial notification, but in empty, they have to do a search and get the results. And then in empty and ID-only, they have to fetch resources. And in full resource, they don't do anything. So the empty had 2 additional requests, the ID only had 1 additional request, and the full resource had 0. So that's kind of a general overview. And again, this convenience, performance needs to be balanced against security, depending on what your channel type is, depending on what your scenario is. So all of those things need to play into it. But we're just trying to provide the pieces you need to do it and the information that you need to make your decisions. We don't know your exact use case. Here's just additional discussion about all of those pieces as well, with some of the PHI notes and things like that. Conformance. This is very short because the idea is that you look at the capability statement and build it from there. But the short version is you need to support the required resources like subscription and subscription topic, and then you shall support at least one payload type and should support at least one channel type from the IG. So you have to support at least one payload type, because if not, there's nothing you support. And then we're saying, if you can, please support one of the official channel types, but that's only a should, because you could say that in your scenario you're just doing it internal to your system and you don't care. And you're still a conformance system, but obviously you're going to have much more limited use. This next section, handling errors, and again, this is just kind of provided as informational things, because we're not going to be able to cover every single potential error. But we're going to give a lot of general classes of errors and how you can detect them and handle them. So here we're talking about, when you run into errors as a server, what should you hopefully do so that clients can know that there's a problem? And then as a client or a subscriber, how can you figure out that there is an error state? So for instance, here we have event sequencing. So every event is supposed to be giving an atomically increasing number. And so as a client, you can say, look, I got 21 and then I got 23. After some period of time, give it a few seconds, a minute, whatever, depending on your scenario, you say, hey, I never got 22. Okay, well, I can go back and do some sort of recovery process, whether via FHIR REST or the events operation, reset the subscription, and continue working. Same thing, we have a heartbeat mechanism that you specify a period in the subscription. And so you say, okay, too much time has gone by. I haven't gotten a notification. This has the wrong graphic for some reason, so I will hopefully update that too. And I want to just be able to, too much time has passed. I'm missing a notification. Let me go back and retrieve that. So the text is right, but the graphic will hopefully be updated before this video is even posted. And then just talking about how you want to recover from errors. Again, this is pretty general because we don't know your use case. We don't know what system you're building, what your recovery process is going to look like. It's probably going to be some set of REST operations, queries, whatever you need to do to rebuild your state of the world. And this should be known to you as a client developer, because it's the same process you would go through at the start. If I'm setting up a new application because I just downloaded your app on my phone, that initial process, that's the same type of thing you'll likely do in your recovery process. Safety and security. Again, we've been trying to make this a consistent theme throughout the spec, but we do have some general security information guidance. We do link to the FHIR security guidance page, which has more detailed things. But in general, be aware you're sending data. You might be sending PHI, you might not, depending on all the different configuration things. You may want additional security, hopefully in some form. Things you should validate, all those different pieces just need to be considered and taken into account. The next section here is artifacts, and it's actually just one page, but it has links specifically to each part. And these are just actual FHIR artifacts. So you can see I mentioned earlier a capability statement, and you can see there's some text here which we are working on updating to make it a little nicer, but we can see the JSON version of the capability statement that we have. Same thing, operations. So we can see like the events operation we mentioned earlier that you can use. Some of these URLs, there's an error in the QA page. So some of these might be changing their definitional names. The $events won't change, but the canonical URLs might. So we're looking at all that. But you can see the parameters it takes in, what kinds of things it's going to return to you, and then the actual structure definition for that operation. And all of these pieces are available for testing in the reference implementation as well. So there's a video describing all of that. Resource profiles, all the different extensions we have, the value sets and code systems we needed to define, and then a whole bucket of examples. So you can see notifications with empty content or full resource, or related resource and full resource, and status contents, all these different things. We tried to fill out all of these examples. So that's everything that's in the implementation guide. And again, there are links to these things as needed. But in the 4.3.0, we can see, if we go to alphabetical, because that's easiest, we can see there's a subscription status, and a subscription topic. And this just has, it's a standard FHIR resource talking about the subscription topic. And it has all the different fields, all the text, and then all of the notes about all these things that are specific to it. So you can see things like the notification shape, defining root resources, additional resources, deriving additional topics. All these different pieces are here in the core specs. Same thing for subscription status. You can see we have the actual resource definition, and then we talk about content and PHI, the different notification types, what you should likely include. So you can see here like an event notification, how optional things are, if they're recommended, required. This event is special because depending on your payload level, you should or shouldn't include, all these different things. And we tried to make this quite clear in the spec. Some more of these wonderful infographics, and I will check those to make sure the right ones are present. And then subscription itself, this is unchanged from R4 to R4B. So you can see it's a pretty straightforward resource. And that's in part why we have all of these extensions. Where did they go? Where are the extensions? There we go. All these extensions are on subscription. And that is just so that we can actually add all the different functionality we needed to add. So, the last section here is downloads. If you're interested in them, this is where you can actually download all the definitions of the IG in a package format, the examples, JSON XML, things like that. So there you go. So that is the R4 Backport version, R4B. And so I will do a similar video here for R5. And yeah, hope to see you at the Connectathon. Cheers.